So this session is the Foundation for Peace through Human Rights, organized by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The session will present views on how to support efforts to build peace and prevent conflict by applying a more inclusive and human rights-based approach to the peace process. Human rights are often seen as an obstacle for making peace or something that needs to be addressed separately from seeking peace. But human rights is all about people and all about what they want and their participation. And peace is also about people and for people. So they are closely related. And in fact, human rights may be able to contribute to building peace, which is sustainable. So from that point of view, today we'd like to seek views of experts who actually talk to North Koreans and civil society organizations in Republic of Korea on a daily basis. They will share their views and particularly on the relationship between human rights and peace. The first speaker is Mr. Imesh Pokharel. He's an officer in charge of the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Seoul. He has been in Seoul for nearly 2 years. So he will first share his views. Imesh, please.
Hello to present from here. Good afternoon. Today I will be presenting the findings of the OHCHR research on the perceptions of the North Korean escapees on human rights and peace process in the Korean peninsula. This discussion paper is titled Laying the Human Rights Foundation for Peace, Supporting an Inclusive and Human Rights-Centered Peace Process in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In early 2018, the situation on the Korean peninsula underwent a shift. The rapprochement between the two Koreas provided a historic opportunity to both establish peace on the Korean peninsula and to address the severe and long-standing human rights concerns in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. While efforts for the peaceful resolution of the conflict continues, human rights issues have so far not been a prominent part of this process, and voices of the people of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, including women, has been absent. United Nations, including our office and the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK, Thomas Contana, has repeatedly emphasized the centrality of the human rights as well as the need for the public participation in the process. It is in this context, this paper was developed by the UN Human Rights Office in Seoul with the following objectives. First, to provide a forum for the DPRK escapees living in the Republic of Korea and to understand their views on what are the human rights issues that are relevant to the ongoing peace process. Second was to initiate a public discourse on the need for a meaningful participation of people from the DPRK in the peace process. And the third was to provide concrete recommendation on what could be the priority human rights issues that has to be addressed for human rights reforms needed in the DPRK. So, the methodology that we used in this paper was we interviewed 63 interviews, primarily women, as most of the escapees who come to the ROK are women. conducted in 2019. The SKPs had mostly left the DPRK in 2018 and 2019. We also organized 3 focus group discussions in 2019, particularly with SKPs who were active in the human rights field. Interviewees, the profile of the interviewees included housewives, persons engaged in commercial activities, teachers, farmers, and students. All interviews were conducted in the Republic of Korea. The office did not have access to the DPRK, so we couldn't interview anyone in the DPRK. The important thing is the sample is a very small sample of SKPs, and so we do not claim that this is representative of the views of all people in the DPRK, and it also obviously does not capture all the spectrum of experience and opinions in the DPRK. But I think the main objective, as we said, is to reiterate that the voices of the people from the DPRK has to be represented in the peace process, and the broad-based consultation with the people from the DPRK is essential for the peace diplomacy. What do SKPs think about peace and denuclearization, reunification, and justice and accountability? The first part of the report primarily deals with that aspects. It also tries to understand the views of the SKPs on justice and accountability and whether they had an opportunity to participate in the peace process. So on the views on peace and denuclearization, the majority of the SKPs that we talked with were aware about the peace process. They also thought that the negotiation focused on reunification, denuclearization, economic development, and the lifting of the sanctions. Urban residents in the DPRK were more informed than the rural people living in the rural areas. However, poor families and those living in rural areas were not much concerned about the ongoing diplomatic efforts. They did not believe that the success of the peace process would help to improve their living conditions. On the denuclearizations, all SKPs believed that it was essential for peace, reunification, and economic development. They were not happy with the military-first policy because they thought that the military-first policy has put too much emphasis on the military, and that was also one of the reasons for the systematic human rights violations in the DPRK. On the reunification, most SKPs viewed that reunification of the 2 Koreas was necessary. However, they were not very sure whether it was feasible given that both political and economic differences were used. They mentioned that the political leadership in both the ROK and the DPRK had tried to present a very ideal concept of reunification, which was not possible in the current political environment. The SKPs also had a view on how the reunification can happen. They thought that the increased economic integration and people-to-people engagement should happen before any political integration. They thought that the economic and social integration would create opportunities for economic development and would also open up an avenue for strengthening rule of law and good governance, which could be necessary prior to any political integration. SKPs also told that they would want a more honest discussions on how the reunification can happen, and that the public of both the countries needs to be part of these process, and they should be properly informed and consulted. On the views about justice and accountability for the serious human rights violations, the SKPs showed that the concept of the justice and accountability was pretty new to many of them. Due to severe restriction on the fundamental freedoms, people did not believe that justice and accountability was even possible. Many people were unaware of their rights, so they necessarily did not question the actions by the state authorities. when asked about what type of accountability mechanisms they would want to see, many didn't understood it, and they were not aware what to expect. But many SKPs told that any accountability mechanisms or processes has to be taken, the context has to be taken when addressing the past human rights violations. They gave few examples, like the low-ranking officials were merely executing orders, and that many authorities in the DPRK might be involved in human rights violations in one or other form, so it might not be possible to punish everyone. So they basically highlighted on the need to look into the context when dealing with the past. Some SKPs, who were primarily the victims of human rights violation, believed that punishment of the perpetrators of serious human rights violation was also necessary to ensure justice. They wanted higher-ranking officials and leadership to take responsibility for the widespread human rights violations. SKPs also emphasized the need for victims of human rights violations and their families to have a voice in any future truth and accountability processes. So that was the first part of this paper. On the second part, what we asked was, what are the main drivers of human rights violations in the DPRK, and what is needed to lay the foundation for peace, stability, and the rule of law in the DPRK? The SKPs identified the following priority human rights areas, and the first is promoting equality and non-discriminations. SKPs identified discrimination based on Songbo as a priority human rights concern. They believe that the Songbo system has created a patronage system. They were of the view that the disregard for human rights was because government officials were mostly from the higher Songbo, and they failed to understand how their actions impacted the lives of poorer and less privileged families. The SKPs demanded or wanted that the government treat all its citizens equally, abolish the Songbo system, and introduce a more merit-based system. Another important aspect that was raised by the SKPs was the gender-based discrimination, and particularly domestic violence, as another major human rights issues in the DPRK, and they thought that the deep-rooted discriminatory stereotypes, lack of protection for survivors, and impunity on incidents of gender-based violence were some of the issues that was promoting domestic violence and gender-based discriminations. They also wanted that the government, that the gender equality happens in both law and practice, and there is a prohibition of all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Another important aspect they raised was ensuring economic and social rights. Many people express concerns about the lack of employment and economic opportunities, and that too has led to the human rights violations. Everyone said that the compulsory state-assigned employment was a major hindrance to seeking economic opportunities, because people were neither paid, or when they were paid very, very little, nor were they allowed to engage in outside economic activities. So people have to pay bribes to the authorities. Women engaged in trade were also vulnerable to sexual exploitations by market managers and officials. Another issue that many of the women raised was that the married women were exempted from the state-assigned jobs. However, they had to participate in labor mobilization for civic projects, and this was an extra burden on women because they were already undertaking household work, taking care of children, and also working in the informal sector to support their family. SKPs also highlighted the rural-urban economic divide. The economic situation was much harder in the inner rural areas than in the regions bordering China, which primarily depended on the trade with China. SKPs also highlighted monetary and in-kind contribution was a financial burden for many families. They provided some examples of how these contributions to the schools and health institutions had affected right to education and health. They also recommended that the government terminate the state-assigned employment program, allow citizens to choose their professions based on individual interests and skills, and also to allow to seek employment opportunities abroad. Another area that the SKPs highlighted was protecting fundamental freedoms and rule of law. They highlighted that the lack of respect for the rule of law and fundamental freedom also has led to the human rights violations, the strict interpretation of the law, discriminatory powers of the authorities, legal ambiguity, and lack of knowledge of laws and policy amongst citizens led to human rights violations and also a bit of climate of fear. They also raised the issue of widespread corruptions among law enforcement officials, and then people were arbitrarily arrested, detained, and prosecuted if they failed to pay bribes. They also raised about the restriction on freedom of movement, which has limited the ability to freely trade, seek job opportunities, receive or impart information, and to engage in social life. They also raised concerns about the abuse and exploitation of women who were, especially in the train stations and while traveling abroad. They also said that many people were unaware of their rights due to severe restriction on the freedom of information and expression. However, they also said that nowadays that marketplaces, especially Jangmadan, has become some hub, an important hub for exchanging information. People were more aware than in the past. And they also said that younger generations have also information now, and they are finding it very hard to accept the severe restrictions in the country. What do SKPs wanted? They wanted the government to uphold fundamental freedoms. They wanted to participate in a meaningful participation in public affairs, especially having a right to say in the selection of the political leadership. They wanted the government to relax the restriction on freedom of movement and make travel safer for women. They also wanted the government to relax the restriction on the freedom of opinion and expression, and to listen to constructive suggestions from its own populations. Another area that they talked about was detention and prison reforms. And many of the SKPs that we talked with had prior detention experience. They mentioned that torture and ill treatment during interrogation and sexual violence against women was prevalent, and detention conditions were inhuman, overcrowded, unsanitary. Political prisons still existed. They wanted improvements in the detention condition and the treatment of detainees. They wanted the government to amend the criminal laws, which has excessive sentences, just like for crossing the border, for conducting business, for making phone calls, and to find alternatives to incarceration for petty crimes. They also highlighted that if the human rights situation has to be improved, then the reforms of Ministry of State Security was very essential, because is one of the agencies which was involved in the human rights violations. Other areas that the SKPs, primarily those who are working on human rights issues in the DPRK, they were disappointed that human rights was not included in the peace diplomacy. They acknowledged that the denuclearization and economic cooperation was a priority for both ROK and the United States, but mentioned that prioritizing human rights is very essential for the people of the DPRK. And they thought that the improvements in the situation of human rights was essential for the long-lasting peace and stability, and also for economic and social development in the DPRK. SKPs mentioned that the DPRK might not proactively undertake human rights reforms if the ROK and the United States didn't prioritize them. Human rights issues, they also said that some of the issues have a humanitarian angle, such as the separated families, the release of foreign nationals detained in the DPRK, and the abduction issues. And these issues given that many of the families are already old, needs immediate attentions. So SKPs primarily wanted the dialogue process to be inclusive and participatory and representative of the views of the people of the DPRK. So that was what the DPRK, the SKPs thought about the priority human rights issues and what can be done to address those human rights concerns and to establish sustainable peace. So based on the views from the North Koreans interviewed, and also taking into account the recommendations from the UN human rights system, the paper presents a set of recommendations which we think can be used as benchmarks for the human rights reforms in the DPRK. And the benchmarks includes recommendations on inclusivity in the peace process, addressing non-discrimination, ensuring economic and social rights, upholding rule of law and fundamental freedoms, undertaking detention reforms, addressing the issues of separated families and abductions, and engaging with the international human rights mechanisms. What can the DPRK do? We think that the DPRK can use these benchmarks as a guide to initiate reforms to improve the human rights situation in the DPRK. And what can the international community do? The international community, including the United States and the ROK, who are at the forefront of the diplomatic engagements with the DPRK, can use these benchmarks to assess the commitment of the DPRK to a meaningful human rights reforms and to measure progress in that regards. So this is a paper which is now available online in our office website. And these are the views of the DPRK SKPs on peace process and on the priority human rights concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imesh. I think it's very rare to hear the voices of North Koreans about how they see peace process. But it was encouraging that they are aware of peace process and also relevant human rights issues. And I think it was particularly encouraging for me that they actually want to participate in the process. So I'd like to invite the next speaker, Ms. Do Kyung-ok. She's a research fellow of KINU, Korean Institute for National Unification. Her recent research focuses on peace process on Korean Peninsula, human rights, and sanctions. You have the floor.
안녕하세요. Good afternoon. As introduced by our moderator, my name is Do Kyung-ok, and I am with KINU. The previous presentation was very interesting. It was something that I always wanted to understand, and it's a valuable research. And when we have the final report ready, I'll be more than happy to read through those reports. And my talk is about peace process on the Korean Peninsula and North Korean human rights issues. As you all know, this is the current situation on the Korean Peninsula. Legally, we are at war, so we are at the armistice situation. The war has not ended. Some say that since the Second World War II, because some time has passed since the armistice agreement, we can assume that the war has ended. But basically, we have the demarcation line, and as well as we also have the armistice agreement, which still applies to the Korean Peninsula. And through peace agreement, we also want to end this armistice situation. And we want to end this war through peace process and peace agreement. And many stakeholders around the Korean Peninsula are making lots of effort to shift the situation on the Korean Peninsula, but there's issues of the stakeholders and the withdrawal of the U.S. Army, and also there's an issue of denuclearization. So all these issues has led to different conflict across different stakeholders. But in 2018, we also had a meaningful declaration between the two Koreas, and also we've seen the U.S. and North Summit, and as a result, we are seeing joint declaration. Although the U.S. withdrawal or army withdrawal issue has not been solved, but there has been some progress about the issue. But in February 2019, since the failure of the U.S. North Korea talk in Hanoi, the progress has been at a standstill. And we believe this deadlock situation can continue on for some time, and that's, I believe, is the prospect that is being shared by many of the experts. The shift of the current situation and the development of peace process on the Korean Peninsula is very challenging, and it needs many different processes leading up to the peace process development, and there are many stakeholders involved. Legally, the situation here is very difficult to define as a single situation. So we're not necessarily at war, and we're also faced by the fact that some define this war as a civil war within a country. So currently, we do not have a war going on, and there's also inter-Korean exchange in terms of economy and other areas. So it's very difficult to define current situation unilaterally. And also, we see some exceptionality in terms of the relationship between the two, because it's not necessarily a relationship between a state versus state. And also, denuclearization and nuclear issue has become an international issue, and the issue between the peace process and denuclearization has become in sync or linked with one another. And through the Korean Peninsula peace process, we want to de-risk the risk of war and the tension on the Korean Peninsula or between the two Koreas, and we are making moves to have permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula with complete denuclearization. And there's also issues of North Korean human rights issue. And since 2013, we've seen heightened interest in human rights in North Korea, and we've had that kind of attention and focus leading up to this point in time. And so we still are faced with challenges to solve this human rights issue. On the Korean Peninsula's peace and human rights issue on the North Korea is something already that was touched upon our speakers, so I'm not going to go into this, but peace and human right is not exclusive with each other. It's something that is supplementary to one another, and in UN, they have a comprehensive and basic approach to peace and human rights issue hand in hand. And when you look at Korea, it seems that there are cases where these two concepts were approached separately. So I say that there was a lack of awareness on this issue, but for me, rather than lack of awareness, I guess there was different emphasis on the priority of where we want to focus on. So that's where the difference lies. Basically, we would say that the peace process would be priority over human rights and vice versa. So I guess we were selective when it came to these two issues. And with the basic Human Rights Act, this issue resurfaced again. And now we put these two words hand in hand to have peace settled on the Korean Peninsula with heightened human rights. But if you look at the different implementation leading up to this point, it hasn't been the situation where these two values were linked in harmony with one another. So if you look at UN human rights mechanism, without dealing with human rights issue on the Korean Peninsula and North Korea, it's difficult to achieve sustainable peace and stability on the peninsula as a whole. And there has been recommendation that human rights and peace process need to go hand in hand. The emphasis on both of this, I think, will contribute in heightening the awareness, and also our ultimate goal is to protect human rights and people's lives through this peace process. The UN's mechanism, therefore, is contributing extensively on this account. And in 2018, 19, and 2020, have emphasized the importance of this mechanism on a year-on-year basis. And how are we going to implement and execute this? The human rights-based peace process has been discussed a lot, and we've been hearing it extensively, and we're learning about the concept. But then it boils down to how, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions on how we can implement this. This issue is something that we need to be very flexible in terms of its approach and its strategy. First, on denuclearization negotiation and peace negotiation, as well as human rights, with the Inter-Korean Summit and the U.S. and North Summit, many expected to see human rights issue being discussed in these different summits when leaders meet with one another. And many emphasize that this should be a good opportunity to discuss this issue. And our reporter, Thomas Quenty, also emphasized that this issue should be included as one of the key agenda. Human rights is the basic and universal rights of human being, and without increased human rights or promotion of human rights, North Korea cannot expect to have development and cooperation with international community. So making human rights as an agenda is absolutely necessary. But as I have mentioned, the situation on the Korean Peninsula is very unique because it's very unique to have this kind of prolonged armistice situation. This armistice situation has continued for 7 decades, and the stakeholders still have deep distrust and antagonistic feelings with one another. So they talk about building trust. But then we need a foundation to really build this kind of trust. And that issue also links to denuclearization. So the peace process on the Korean Peninsula is rather very complex and challenging. And what is realistic and efficient is we need to look at North Korean human rights issue in a step-by-step and through a cooperation lens. We cannot be rather too competitive in discussing this human rights issue. Of course, that will ignite some resistance on the North Korean side, and that will put us even further away from peace and protection of human rights. So we need to secure space for human rights cooperation by improving relationship and between the different stakeholders. The one that should actually improve these human rights should be the North Korean authorities and North Korea. So it is important for North Korea to build a capability to actually promote human rights. And through human rights dialogue and technical cooperation, we really need to enhance capability of North Korea to improve human rights. But when it comes to human rights dialogue and technology cooperation, it's something that North Korea has to accept. So it is very important for us to create a conducive political environment for North Korea to embrace this. And if it is difficult for us to promote human rights dialogue and technical cooperation through conventional approach, we can think about other indirect ways to do this. We can, for instance, devise an Asia or regional discussion forum to encourage North Korea to participate. For human rights dialogue, In the early process of Korean Peninsula peace process, we can talk about separated family issue as a priority issue to move this dialogue to the next level. And also, North Korea is focusing, or we can focus and talk about human rights improvement effort toward underprivileged people like women and children. For technical cooperation, for separated family issue has long been dealt as a humanitarian issue, and we were not approaching this as a human rights issue, and it was rather a new concept for us. In the UN Human Rights Office, they came up with the report on the separated family, and the implication from that report, I think, is something that we have to consider. So the two Koreas should be the owner of this human rights protection, and they need to be proactive in participating in this human rights dialogue, as well as leading this effort as one of the key owners. And for underprivileged families or people, some may think that we are reactive because we're not actively raising issues around it, but this is to have a strategic approach toward human rights issue, to look at both human rights and peace process in parallel to each other. And technical cooperation is something that we can approach with the recommendation that UPR has accepted through first, second, and third round of UPR. And also, if there are some resistance on the technical cooperation program, we can also consider technology cooperation along with UNDP to look at rule of law and law enforcement, justice, and governance area. And it could be international institution or it could be an individual state, but we can devise some kind of technical cooperation to have a human rights cooperation space. And North Korean residents who are actually the owner of this human rights can build capability to further promote their own human rights. And in closing, this is something that I have prepared as a recommendation for peace and human rights on the Korean Peninsula. And these efforts are highly welcomed, and through this effort, we can not only bring a peace process on the Korean Peninsula, but also improve human rights. So regarding stakeholders around the Korean Peninsula, many stakeholders are aware that they need to put concerted effort to improve peace and human rights on the Korean Peninsula. And also panel of experts and people in the field accept this as something that is for granted. But if you look at individual citizens, there are still some lack of awareness. So we need to further promote this awareness. And this is also a conflict within South Korea. And including the Seoul UN Human Rights Office, we have a role to play to promote this idea and have a single view on this as a society. And Professor Cho Hyo-jae mentioned this, and this is something that is very dear to my heart, so I'm writing this and quoting him. And the policy decision around human rights is either decided on the limited rationality or uncertainty of the future. So it is rational to consider this, and evaluate this on a special context is right. And complex international political power dynamics around human rights is something that we need to consider, and the context should be considered in where human rights norm and how much human rights norm will be considered. So we believe we need to enhance awareness of not just North Korean authorities, but North Korean people and its residents to really enhance the human rights within North Korea. And without that, it will be very difficult to improve human rights situation within North Korea. And we have to make that clear to North Korea and North Korean authority. And last but not least, in order to improve human rights in North Korea, many stakeholders are carrying out different efforts. And in order to do that, and we need to carry out these efforts to have effective and clear policy. So we need to divide roles and responsibility between these different stakeholders and increase cooperation and communication with one another. With that, I end my presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Do. First of all, I agree with you that priorities are set without much awareness, maybe, or information sharing. But I think the governments and also all of us have the responsibility to raise awareness and encourage discussions in order to decide on the priorities. And that's key, actually, for participation of people, which is one of the important part of human rights-based approach. And your comprehensive presentation also made me understand the complicated and unique situation of the Korean peninsula. But I think you are right about taking step-by-step approach, and I think the key is to find entry points, and actually there are a lot of potential entry points that actually the government of North Korea has agreed in the international human rights mechanisms like universal periodic reviews. For example, gender issues, economic rights, there are already agreements and common understanding. So I think it's, as you said, important to take realistic steps rather than completely separating the denuclearization and peace process and human rights process. Yeah. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite the next speaker, Mr. Oh Se-hyuk. He was born in North Korea and defected in 1999, arrived in the Republic of Korea in 2002. He has over 6 years of experience in interviewing North Korean escapees from different civil society organizations and also as a news reporter. Please share your views on peace and human rights. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. It is my honor to speak about North Korean defectors, human rights abuse survivors, and victims that must have suffered from the government of North Korea. I think it will be useful to briefly remind of the theoretical definitions of civil society and organizations because my presentation will be focused on what's the importance and roles of CSOs and victims groups, escapists in promoting, advocating human rights and public participation in the peace process. And the later part of my presentation will also focus on what's the challenges and the solutions. In theory, civil society can monitor what the government does not work on enough or undermines in public service delivery, policymaking, or implementation process, which is so-called governance. So CSOs have filled the gaps where the government is not doing enough. Over the last 2 decades, regarding inter-Korean issues such as North Korean human rights, nuclear programs, military provocations, humanitarian aid provision to DPRK, CSOs experience resources and knowledge or human network have served maximum effects of the inter-Korean policies of the local governments and the mitigating risks caused by North Korea. CSOs can enable diverse actors in South Korea to take actions that the government wishes it could, but cannot. A society without CSOs is a monolith. So South Korea civil society can advocate and work for North Korean human rights in a way the South Korea government cannot, because the South Korea government wants to keep good relations with the North, while NGOs do not need to do. So my presentation is, first one, CSO's roles will be pressuring. It is possible for CSOs to maintain their strategic focuses, which enables them to pressure the government to table human rights and voices of human rights victims on summits and high-level meetings. It is a well-known practice that the government negotiators are too much used to easily putting aside human rights issues from the meetings tables for the sake of the accomplishment. So experience has shown that many governments, ROK and US, both have done this, want to keep human rights out of their negotiations because they think it can get in the way. But the reality is that human rights issues need to be part of all discussions. Otherwise, whatever governments are made won't be implementable. And NGOs can remind the negotiator governments of this inconvenient truth. So second one is monitoring. CSOs and NKD groups and escapes can contribute to monitoring mistakes of the government and deeper understanding about the counterpart and changes inside the country. Last year, on November 7th, 2 North Korean fishermen who were accused of killing 16 other North Korean people on the boat were returned by the government. The government convicted the accusation just in 5 days without giving the returnees opportunities for due process, did not disclose the interrogation process. International human rights organizations, local CSS and NKD groups expressed the concerns of the government decision to deport the North Koreans despite its obligations to protect anyone who would be at a substantial risk of torture or other serious human rights violations after repatriations. On the other hand, there have been other information by an NKD internet news outlet against the government conviction, even though the source still needed cross-checking. The reason this is important is we must monitor our governments to ensure it is living up to its ideals and commitments. One reason it was so terrible, the way the government acted towards the fishermen, is that it acted more like the North Korean government than the South Korean government. And the South Korean government is meant to be better than that. So someone has to call them out. Third one is amplify victims' voice. NKDs and escapees living in South Korea serve to deliver voices of the people suffering from human rights abuses inside and outside North Korea. In particular, in the given situation that North Korea government does not allow for any independent international human rights organization access to the country in the scope of the mandatory delivery. Secondly, the civic groups of the people from North Korea can contribute to human rights documenting and monitoring human rights situations inside the country via their personal networks and the remaining family members. the establishment of UN Commission of Inquiry and its landscape report were the most representative example that has a desirable collaboration of the government and its CSOs. Indeed, it was the splendid success that was made by concerted efforts of local and international CSOs, along with human rights abuse survivors from North Korea. I can't stop mentioning the former prisoner survived in the prison, the Camp 18, for 28 years. Her testimony to not be played, former High Commissioner. And last one is guiding to be normalized. I believe without respecting human rights and a stable and sustainable peace process will be hardly be made with North Korea. In order for North Korea to be ready as a normal counterpart with South Korea to face international human rights monitoring process will be prerequisite, just as South Korea does. I think CSOs can play an important role in guiding North Korea to the process of the human rights monitoring and improving mechanisms. For example, recently, sustainable development goals approach has been popularized among some CSOs community because North Korea has responded to sub-regional technical trainings of SDG mechanism. However, they will also need to call for the government of North Korea to address the Goal 16, peace and justice, strong institutions. There are also technical assistance processes that might be applicable to North Korea within the conventional human rights treaty body mechanisms, depending on the steps that the government concerned takes on. So, before talking about the possibility or challenges for CSOs and the victims group to promote human rights in the peace process, I would like to propose the audience today to contemplate what the peace process means to be. It will be reasonable to assume that peace process will not be one-time happening. Rather, propose us to imagine amount of times and some prominent steps that North Korea shall inevitably get through to enter the peace process. The steps will be denuclearization and human rights violations. Let's elaborate some political and social functioning of nuclear program of North Korea. Nuclear has been used as a political leadership performance tool of Kim Jong-un. 1 or 2 months ago, Kim Jong-un said that no one would attack North Korea because of the nuclear. How distorted his speech is. South Korea and US has reaffirmed their priority of regional stability, but North Korea has often utilized the military tension rise for their political performance. Very recently, demolishing the Legion office and a gunshot the guard post on the side of South Korea. Secondly, in North Korea, nuclear works as a gatekeeper to block its people's access to better economic prosperity, freedom of movement, travel. International community has shown him and his leadership the blueprints after denuclearization. However, the government of North Korea seems more complacent about remaining the current state of the national economy and diplomatic closeness. Thus, denuclearization will require the process of institutional and strategic perspective change of the leadership of North Korea. Then, how can you identify North Korea is seriously ready for it? I think whether North Korea is ready to be accountable for a single issue of its human rights violation could be a good indicator. So, what if North Korea returns South Koreans detained in North Korea, or public apology for Japanese abductees, or South Korean abductees during Korean War? What if North Koreans are free to travel abroad, or choose when to work, where to reside? What if North Koreans are free to access the information they want to know about, hear about it, to watch? So next, I am going to list up some challenges for CSOs and the NKD groups, and then present some solutions that I see at the same time as possibilities of them. So challenge one is North Korean human rights issues are too much politicized. This makes NKD victims' voice unheard, and the people who have survived and witnessed human rights abuse hesitate to speak about what they have gone through in public, even with trustful human rights monitors. There are many more people who have not told, but they are afraid that they might be stigmatized politically and socially if they talk about the human rights. Whether you speak about the human rights or not become a sort of criteria that judge the survivors' political spectrum or which side they belong to. So, solutions I propose: North Korean defectors and human rights abuse survivors, victims should be able to speak about their experience in North Korea in public and to human rights monitoring organizations without fearing about the political prejudice. To make this possible, policymakers and opinion leaders, including members of the society, should put more efforts to listen to the NKD survivors, speaking more, NKD survivors speaking, and more education content about the system and the people in North Korea should be made public. And challenge two, South Korea's passive inter-Korea policies on human rights issues and engaging North Korea in international human rights mechanism result in blocking diverse channels, discouraging any civil activities to address recommendation and findings of the COI report within the framework that is acceptable by international law. So these days, those countries that are less democratic are taking advantage of the approach separating human rights and civic awareness raised from humanitarian and engagement exchange. I am doubtful that this approach would bring about any sustainable peace process, but will be a temporary purge. So solutions will be the government of South Korea should explore diverse channels that can engage North Korea with the international human rights mechanism, encourage civil society organizations and NKD groups to participate in the multilateral human rights dialogues and create chance for them to collaborate with international CSOs. The policymakers will need a thought transition that the denuclearization of North Korea is also a matter of human rights and the institutional change. So challenge is free. CSS and NKD-turned groups need capacity building to understand international human rights mechanisms, the internationally acceptable scope. They need to develop communication skills with diverse international and local stakeholders and targeting audiences in international diplomacy arena, how to engage more partners, supporters with their activities. So solutions: international organizations can program capacity buildings for NKD-led groups and the victims groups. A good example, UN's office has started core group meetings of NKD-led organizations. The meeting could be an alternative mechanism that constructively and effectively reflects the North Korean escapees and defectors' voice into the monitoring and a concerted message on regular basis. For about 2 decades, International Republican Institute and National Democracy Institute and National Endowment for Democracy have run programs to empower NKD groups and advocacy for human rights and the training for human rights. And that the training should be designed to help the trainees thoroughly review policies of North Korean government so that they can sharpen the issue-based and fact-based approaches beyond the emotional feelings. Recent challenges demand for more innovative, creative strategy development to engage more local and international young civic-minded activists in the existing civic movements of the people from the North, and take advantage of applicable technologies inside targeting country. North Korea is not a society that dynamically is changing. Nevertheless, that does not justify us to be lazy to discover opportunities for action. And then 4, challenge 4, stigmatizing civic activities. North Korean defectors have now become a common troublesome of the two Korea's government and the public. When North Koreans are featured on the South Korean news outlet, they could be seen as if they would have volunteered to rally denouncing North Korean defectors. The NKDs in South Korea are blamed by the local people for their information dissemination activities. So instead of pointing out the ways of the activities themselves are being deterred. So my solutions for this, to help the public of South Korea understand about North Koreans and NKDs and their human rights sufferings under oppressive policies of the North Korean government, types and contents of public information about people's life in North Korea should be diversified. So North Korean defector groups should put more efforts to expand common ground, sympathy about North Korean human rights with the broader public of South Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oh, for several very important points. One of them, I also would like to emphasize that the role of civil society organizations and victims groups are even more critical at the moment because the already limited information coming from North Korea is further limited due to the COVID-19 measures. International communities are shrinking and they are not moved out of Pyongyang, therefore they cannot actually monitor and report on the situation outside of Pyongyang. And North Korean escapees who can reach Republic of Korea, the number has declined dramatically. Therefore, the role that civil society organizations can play as voices, representing voices of North Koreans, those who are already in ROK, but also those who are left in DPRK is even more important. And I think both governments and international community really have to support the civil society organizations. And I would like to ask if there are any questions from the audience on the somewhere at home listening in to this seminar. Maybe while waiting for some questions, I would also like to take the opportunity to just introduce what the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Mr. Thomas O'Hare Quintana, said about peace and human rights in his in the last Human Rights Council in March 2020. First of all, he really supports the efforts made by the government of Republic of Korea, particularly Ministry of Unification, to promote peace process. And he is of the view that a peace declaration should not be put on hold pending the completion of denuclearization. He says this because swift resolution of the technical war status that Ms. Do mentioned, the resolution of this situation would create the atmosphere and space needed for further discussion on denuclearization itself, less isolation of North Korea, more access, and greater respect for human rights. So it's not only the human rights who could contribute peace process, but he is saying that making peace itself could create a space for promoting denuclearization and also for human rights. And he also referred to civil society movements such as Women Cross DMZ, and he believes that the governments need to listen to their voices more proactively, because there are such initiatives and movements on the ground, but governments need to efforts to listen to them and bring them into the process and conversations. That's what Special Rapporteur recommended to the Human Rights Council in March 2020. Are there any questions coming in? Do you want to say, listening to each other, do you maybe each speaker wants to add some words, final remarks? We will wait. Yes, please, Mesh.
Yeah, I think I can reiterate on the role of the CSO that Sehok mentioned, that while our office has always been supportive of the necessity for the participation of the civil society organizations in the peace process and listening to their views.
Your microphone, sorry, Mesh, is off. It's on the back.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's on the, here, on the shoulder. Yeah.
All right, some glitch. It's okay now?
Now it's on your thing.
Yeah.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, it's working, the microphone. Okay.
Okay. Hello. Yeah.
We got it.
Yeah. All right. No, I was just highlighting that what Sehok said is that our office has been promoting the need for the inclusion of the civil society organizations and primarily the SKPs living in the ROK to be part of the any peace processes. While the government has the authority to negotiate with the DPRK, the public participations provide a better legitimacy to the governments to make that decisions. And then I think it is in that context, whether it's in ROK or whether it's even in DPRK, I think the government has to make efforts to listen to what their views are. And we have seen in other countries also, sometimes they have excellent ideas and which the government might not be thinking about, and having that regular engagement with the civil society organizations or the victims or or their families allows to understand the context as well as makes some of the peace processes initiatives more relevant. And it also tries to address the root causes of the conflict or the differences and to come up with the more legitimate decisions. So we fully support the initiatives of the CSOs, and we have tried to become more like I wouldn't say messenger, but at least try to talk with both the CSOs and the government and to pass those messages to each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Imesh. Are there any, still, we are open for questions from online. In the meantime, would you like to add any?
As I spoke in the presentation, the peace process won't be this like a one-time happening, and so it will require, a certain amount of time and the kind of prominent steps that we can identify that North Korea is really ready for the peace process. But I'd like to hear from the Dr. Do, and she also mentioned that that in the peace process or in the human rights and the peace process, putting together in that the process will be in a stepwise and a step-by-step in a fashion. So I'd like to hear any kind of her ideas. For example, in my presentation, I mentioned that North Korea has responded to they shown that they're high interest in the SDG approach, and then of course they also submitted that the reports to UPR. But if she has any more ideas and thoughts about that.
네,
Well, as you have mentioned, the peace process is a process. As the wording goes, it has to go through different phases. And when you look at the Korean Peninsula peace process, it also has to go through different phases. That's inevitable. Then having said that, when we have human rights in our mind, and what peace process ultimately pursues is human rights, and when we can agree to that, then we have to think about how we're going to achieve that. As I have mentioned in my presentation, DPRK, since 2010, their attitude or their position is that EPR or UN human rights mechanism is something that they continue to participate in. Human rights treaty, where there is some children-related treaty or non-discrimination treaty for women is something that North Korea is participating. So there has been some attitude change on the North Korean side. Many scholars in the past mentioned that there are 5 phases to promoting human rights. So first phase would be denial. Second would be concession on a tactical basis. So there were different phases that was defined by scholars. So whatever was the intention of the North Korea, they are bound to be obligated to implement what they have said and what they have promised. So North Korea, so long as they show their position and as long as they get feedback from the international society, they will continue on this track. So it's important for us to keep that feedback loop. But when you look at typical human rights dialogue or technical cooperation, it's something that North Korea might not accept in the near term. Of course, we are making effort to make recommendation to North Korea through the Human Rights Office and other parties, but maybe we can also try a different track to accommodate different discussion forum. So it is important for us to continue on this dialogue. What North Korea is interested in is economic area and economic and social spheres. And when you look at North Korea, they sometimes like or take interest in providing human rights related training to their officials and people, and also improving the human rights for their prisoner is something that we emphasize to North Korea when we communicate with them. So we need to continue on doing that to prolong the dialogue. And also, North Korea is refining its law as well. And through that process, laws are amended to accommodate human rights value, but there's also room for improvement. So when they amend their law, international community can provide support and help so that they can rightly reflect human rights value on their law. And that's something that we can do to bring changes, although it may be gradual.
Thank you very much. There's no questions coming from the audience. So thank you very much for all the speakers for really interesting views and discussions. I think it's already a good sign that we were given one session to talk about how human rights and peace process can support each other in this very important Korea Global Forum for Peace. And I think it's, yes, of course, our responsibility to push governments, but I think all of us need to continue our efforts to engage and support efforts coming from civil society organizations and from people. I think I would like to just also remind myself and conclude the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.